Welcome everyone to this webinar on India's UNSC presidency. Let me also welcome and thank our partner, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, in joining us in organizing this webinar today. My name is Rajagopalan. I'm the Director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation. I'll be moderating this panel looking at the major takeaways, the hurdles and challenges that India may have faced in pursuing three key areas of maritime security, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism during its one-month presidency in August 2021. In terms of key outcomes, we have seen that India's presidency started off with a high-level signature meeting on maritime security presided over by Prime Minister Modi. India's permanent representative, Ambassador Tirumurthy, called it path-breaking since this was the first time the Prime Minister of India was chairing the Security Council. Despite the fact that maritime security has come up as a dominant issue over the past couple of decades, it also happened to be the first time that there was a comprehensive debate on maritime security, addressing the issue in a holistic manner. A presidential statement on maritime security was also issued for the first time, highlighting India's role in pushing this agenda in a concrete fashion. This is particularly significant because the statement focused on the primacy of international law, underlining the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas UNCLOS as the legal framework for all maritime activities. This is significant also because presidential statements happen only when there is consensus of all the members. China reportedly did have some objections to the language on UNCLOS, but India managed to bridge the issue and help frame a language that was acceptable to all. Besides, there were a couple of other meeting sessions, one on technology and peacekeeping, and the second one was a high-level briefing on threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. India also reportedly exchanged a memorandum of understanding, MOU, with the UN in support of the Partnership for Technology in Peacekeeping initiative and to the UNC4ISR Academy. India's UNSC presidency ended with the first resolution being adopted by the Council on the situation in Afghanistan following the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. Now, to take us through all that has happened over the month of August, we have three terrific panelists. But before I hand it over to the panel, I have the pleasure of inviting Yahia Alibi, Head of Regional Delegation, International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, to deliver his opening remarks. Over to you, Mr. Alibi. The screen is yours.
Hopefully I'm mute. I'm audible.
I can hear you.
Good afternoon to everybody. Good morning to my colleague from Geneva. Really happy to have this opportunity on behalf of the ICRC here in Delhi, the regional delegation, to deliver a few remarks on this important issue and subject. Thanks, my dear Raji, for this introduction. And I would like, if you allow me, to warm thanking my colleagues in ORF. Really, we are proud of this partnership. Thank you for this timely initiative. It's very important as India is actually playing a leading role in building consensus at global level on global policy important issues. Let me also take this occasion, as you mentioned, to congratulate India for the impressive really outcome of its membership, which is lasting, but also about its presidency of the Security Council last month. It was impressive. Actually, they started this membership in last January, if I well remember, and it started by two high-level signatory events on maritime security, which one of the big global issues shared by His Excellency the Prime Minister, followed by two other signatory events on peacekeeping, on technology, and also on briefing to the Security Council on the Islamic State. The presidency ended with the first resolution being adopted by the Council on the situation of Afghanistan, which is also one of the issue of the day, and following the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban movement. As for the discussion today, our panelists, Ambassador Puri, Ambassador Mukherji, and my colleague from Geneva, Eva, they will focus on the challenge facing the global efforts to build consensus on this issue of counterterrorism, identify the areas that really need further engagement at all levels. Building consensus needs engagement, and one of the areas that needs attention is the role of humanitarian action in conflict zones, and the need to strengthen the humanitarian language in the counter-terrorism resolution and measures, be it at the global level, be it at state levels. There is, I think we all agree, obviously, a legitimate concern of the states and all of us about terrorism, the need to impose strong, restrictive countermeasures and tools to target specific states, organizations, and individuals. But we are a humanitarian principled organization, we are working in the field in more than 80 countries, and based on the field experience, evidence, and based on our day-to-day management of the operation on behalf of civilian population that needs support, protection, and assistance, we found out, and I think we are here also to share some concrete example from the field and not only discussion about legal dimension. It's that some restrictive measures, ever growing actually, are which are legally binding. You have civil, criminal, administrative rules, sanction regime, counterterrorism legislation that restricts to the maximum any relationship, any transaction with these groups or targeted groups or states. Based on this experience, we have been engaging at the global level, at the state level, on bilateral, that these restrictive measures prove some often actually problematic, as they can affect what we believe as principled humanitarian action. They can render the delivery of humanitarian service more difficult, even impossible, especially in the absence of humanitarian caveats, and there are no humanitarian, if there's no humanitarian exemption in these resolutions. My colleague Eva will share also some concrete example from different fields, and especially from Somalia. Hence, today's event is really for me a milestone with the prominent panelists that we have and the experience of the two ambassadors. It's a milestone event as part of the ongoing, we see it, global discussion and engagement to build this consensus for what? For, I do think, the need to strike the right balance between two imperatives. The first one, I think, the fighting terrorism and the need of counter-terrorism measures, but preserving the ability of the impartial, neutral humanitarian actors to provide the people affected by armed conflict with the protection and assistance they need. How to strike these balances? We have been engaging at the level of New York, Geneva, and bilaterally with many states. And actually today with India playing this global role to build the consensus about the counter-terrorism, I do think that this event is very important. And I'm looking forward to listen to our prominent panelists and wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you so much, Mr. Alibi. And you have set out some of the critical issues that will come up during this discussion, during this panel. Right now, let's shift to the panel. And I'm delighted to introduce three terrific panelists to talk to us about the UN presidency India has had and the kind of issues. So I'll go in the same order as given in on the agenda. It'll be interesting to hear from the panelists their assessments of the Indian presidency, what happened, but also what could have been done, what did not happen, what are the different challenges that may have posed to India in terms of building support across the room on the three key issues that India focused on, as well as the critical role of the P5 in pursuing its agenda, because without the P5, if they are divided, then there is a possibility of disagreement and there's no resolution. So it's kind of important to kind of hear what really transpired and how the India's presidency is being assessed. So let me first invite Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, former Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations and the former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Over to you, Ambassador Puri, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Raji, and the distinguished panelists. It's a great pleasure to be here together. And I congratulate you on convening this panel, because I think we need to have this kind of an assessment about what are the takeaways, and particularly because this particular presidency had some very important outcomes which have an impact on all of the unfolding events, including in Afghanistan. So let me begin by recalling that India has a history of memorable August presidencies, if I may call it, of the UN Security Council. And in 2011, when Hardeep Singh Puri presided over it, Libya became a cause célèbre and for something which was a trial by fire. Exactly 10 years later, in this staycation month, a veritable geopolitical earthquake and resulting tectonic shifts in Afghanistan have challenged India's presidency. And India passed that test with flying colors, in my view. Maintaining a sthita pragya calm, it focused on safeguarding and advancing issues of vital interest for India, but also for what I call the global public goods of counterterrorism, peace, and security. What set our 2021 presidency apart, and both of you have referred to that, was the highest level engagement and leadership of Prime Minister Modi himself. He set the vision of the 5 S's of Samman, Samvad, Sahyog, Shanti, and Samriddhi for India at the UN Security Council, and vowed to bring the voice of those unrepresented in achieving the new orientation for new reformed multilateralism. So he made history, indeed, by becoming the first Prime Minister of India to personally address and chair the United Nations Security Council event, and that too on an essential and urgent matter of global concern, maritime security. The External Affairs Minister, Foreign Secretary, and the PMI team led by Ambassador Tirumurti, as you mentioned, too projected India's leadership well, enhancing India's claim to be a value-adding permanent member of the Security Council. Indian presidency delivered the highest number of substantive outcomes, 14, with 5 full-fledged resolutions on the situations in Afghanistan, Somalia, Middle East, Mali, UN peacekeeping operations, and 4 statements of the President of UNSC, PRST, on UN peacekeeping operations, West Africa, Sudan, and maintenance of international peace and security. And 5 press statements, 3 of them responding in real time to developments in Afghanistan, including the Kabul airport terrorist attack. So for those who are saying that, it was not responsive, this is a lie. Then India organized events around 3 signature themes, as you mentioned, Raji, of maritime security, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism, all of critical importance to India, but also requiring a new international consensus on updating of the rules of the game. August 9, maritime security event was path-breaking, as again you said, in evolving a holistic concept of maritime security and what it entails. Of course, the role of UNCLOS, freedom of navigation, a sensitive topic given China's muscle flexing in South China Sea and the latest being its new maritime rules. Sea-launched terrorist attacks like the 2008 one in Mumbai, trafficking in arms, drugs and humans, etc. The outcome advanced Indian security interests while contributing, hopefully, towards a new international maritime order. President Putin, and I was told that he was participating in something like this after 16 years. So he made a special gesture to be there, and President Kenyatta of Kenya, and Prime Minister of Vietnam, and a number, and Secretary of State Blinken and several foreign ministers joined in. Then the event on protecting the protectors, technology and peacekeeping, and India as the largest troop contributing country with 250,000 troops having been contributed cumulatively, recorded some historic firsts too. A resolution on accountability for crimes against peacekeepers, and the first PRST on peacekeeping and technology on upgrading technological capacity of peacekeepers was passed. The EAM chaired event on threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist act brought a laser focus on continued terrorist threats and attacks, early conclusion of the comprehensive convention against international terrorism, India's 8-point action plan, and which refers to something that Yahia said, to reinforce the just revised and comprehensive UN global counterterrorism strategy. So the Indian consultative power was also deployed on issues like Myanmar, renewal of sanctions on Mali, of UN mission in Somalia, situations in the Middle East, Ethiopia, Haiti, and DPRK. But its diplomatic sagacity, persuasive power, and rapid response agility was really tested most by the tsunami of Afghan developments that happened in telescope time during this month. This at a time, mind you, when the UN was being mocked for being unable to forewarn, prevent, and then remain on the ground to respond to the enormous peace and security, humanitarian and human rights crisis developing there. So India convened on Afghanistan, if I may digress from, I know you want only 3, but I do want that this is very important because everything is interlinked. India convened 3 meetings on 6th, 16th, and 30th, when the landmark resolution 2593 was passed. The Taliban takeover has raised serious concerns about it becoming a haven for terrorist groups, but also they're getting a free run to mount attacks on other neighboring countries and also globally. Through resolution 2593, the UNSC demanded that Afghan territory not be used to threaten or attack any country, or to shelter or train terrorists, or to plan or finance terrorist acts. It specifically mentioned individuals and entities designated by the UNSC Resolution 1267, which for India includes Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, importance of combating terrorism in Afghanistan, and noted Taliban's relevant commitments, contrary to some buzz in India about the missing T word. There are 3 T's: terrorism, terrorist entities, and Taliban accountability. Other major benchmarks include the demand from Taliban, and I want to underline benchmarks, the demand from Taliban to allow safe evacuation of foreigners, and living up to its 27th statement, August statement, that Afghans will be able to travel abroad, leave Afghanistan anytime, and exit via any border point. It calls on all parties to allow full, safe, and unhindered access for the UN and all humanitarian actors in relief activity, including the IDPs, to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches all in need, that donors support Afghanistan and major Afghan refugee hosting countries, and all parties respect their obligations under the humanitarian law, including on the protection of civilians. So all the ground rules on that have been laid. It affirms the importance of upholding human rights, especially and including those of women, children, and minorities, which in India's case bears on the well-being of Hindu and Sikh Afghans there. So all parties are to seek an inclusive, negotiated political settlement, and there with the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. And that the last 20 years gains on the rule of law and human rights front are not lost, are safeguarded. India was also able to ensure that UNSC resolution laid down some important benchmarks to guide the international community on calibrating its relations with the emerging Taliban regime and setting standards of behavior and policy for it in order to win diplomatic recognition and economic and political support. Now, whether they will, live up to is another matter, but at least it is there. The benchmarks are there. The US was keenly pushing the resolution for both, as can be understood, domestic and strategic reasons. And both President Biden and Secretary Blinken have indicated that Taliban is expected to live up to these norms. France and UK and Ireland underscored the importance of not only allowing the country to become a haven for terrorism, but that the government will be judged not on words, but on deeds. For Russia, of course, it was a moment of sweet revenge to see the US relive its own painful withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. And South Caucasian security concerns notwithstanding, Taliban threat could be seen by Russia as advantageous to bring Central Asian countries closer to it. And Ambassador Mukherjee, of course, can give a better perspective on that, but that's my limited understanding of what I'm seeing, including what's happening in Panjshir now and no intervention from Iran and Russia. China used it for grandstanding as the new benign superpower supporting Afghanistan against so-called hegemonists. Both Russia and China, with different nuances, sought to portray themselves as champions of the Afghans and the Taliban. They refused to support a resolution that so-called turned the tables on Taliban when the US's 20 years failed occupation and its hasty withdrawal were the culprits. They argued that to achieve fundamental changes and stability is vital to work with and guide the Taliban. They criticized the possible brain drain, freezing of assets, and economic sanctions as harmful for Afghanistan. They pointed to US-Australian culpability for killing innocent Afghan civilians. On counterterrorism, they wanted a balanced approach to include their terrorists of concern, including ETIM for China. Given these objections, that India was able to persuade them, and that's the point you raised, not to veto the resolution and only abstain so that the resolution could be passed was a big diplomatic win. US, France, and UK, and all P5 countries actually have tweeted their appreciation of India's presidency, and all the non-permanent member countries as well have appreciated the role that India has played and the leadership that has been exercised and the added value of India's bridge building in a polarized UNSC dynamics. And also the UN Secretary General has very much appreciated India's role in securing a UNSC response to the vexed Afghan question, especially at this juncture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Puri. That was very comprehensive, very extensively. You have covered the issue. Let me, and I'm sure a lot of questions will come back to it. Let me move to our second panelist, Ambassador Asoke Mukherji, who was a former permanent representative of India to the United Nations. Again, somebody who's got so much of experience to tell us about what happened during the presidency and take us through this. Over to you, Ambassador Mukherji. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Raji. And after that very comprehensive intervention by Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, I find that my job is actually probably a bit easier to do, because I would like to build on what she had said. And I look at it in terms of India's declared objectives as elected member of the Security Council. Our foreign minister and our prime minister have identified 4 priorities for India. And during the month of August, it's useful to look at how these 4 priorities were pushed ahead in terms of achieving some outcomes. The first priority and the overriding priority set by our Prime Minister in September last year is reformed multilateralism. And at the heart of reformed multilateralism is the question of the reform of the United Nations Security Council and the way decisions are taken by the Security Council. Now, India's presidency in August came against a backdrop of a lot of polarization between the permanent members, which in a sense resulted in several vetoes being cast on issues which are burning issues in Asia, especially Syria. Resolutions have been vetoed, and resolutions have not been able to be adopted on Yemen, even on the Middle East, on the Palestinian question. So I think that the fact that at the end of August, a resolution on Afghanistan was adopted without a veto speaks of an incremental move by India in reaching the objective of trying to reform the way the Security Council takes decisions. And I think that that's a marker for the remaining part of India's membership of the Security Council this time till December 2022. The second priority which was articulated was to make counterterrorism more effective and to reach out to ensure actors outside the Security Council were part of the attempt by the Security Council to make its resolutions, which give mandates for counterterrorism, more effective. And I think here the discussion that we had, and Ambassador Lakshmi Puri talked about it on the Taliban, showed that there is a second narrative which has also emerged out of India's presidency. The second narrative seeks to undo or to set right some of the problems that arose from the first narrative. If I take you back, the first narrative began soon after Osama bin Laden was killed in May 2011, when the Security Council adopted Resolution 1988 in June 2011, which separated the Taliban from the Al-Qaeda with the objective of bringing back into the political structure of Afghanistan those Taliban who had renounced terrorism and who had affirmed their adherence to the constitution of Afghanistan. I think that was the important part, because India has been one voice in the Security Council that has consistently spoken of the legitimacy of elected government and the ability and effectiveness of an elected government to counter threats, not only to peace and security, but also to global threats such as terrorism. And you can see the statements made earlier in the year on Iraq, on Somalia, on Yemen. We have always, on Syria, we have been focusing on the need for an elected representative government to take, to respond to peace and security issues. And I think that in the case of Afghanistan, this focus has been lost sight of. And it's for to the credit of India that in the resolution 2593 that was adopted on Afghanistan, there is a reference to 1267, which is the first of the resolutions of the Security Council on the Taliban, adopted in 1999. So I agree with Ambassador Lakshmi Puri that the Taliban actually do feature very prominently in the document that has been adopted by the Security Council, contrary to a lot of speculation in the media that India has gone soft on the Taliban or has somehow lost the plot. The focus, and for me this is important, the focus is that Resolution 2593 which was adopted actually sets the stage for the next step. And the next step is to recalibrate what went wrong with the Doha Agreement and the endorsement of the Security Council in 2020 of the Doha Agreement, which is that there was no mention of a political transition mission. You see, in all these cases of conflict, and especially for organizations, humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross or the others who are from the United Nations specialized agencies, you need the supportive structure of a political transition mission. Now, we've done it in Sudan most recently when we introduced UNITAMS. We did it in South Sudan for over 7 years between 2005 and 2011. We did it before that in East Timor, and we did it before that in Namibia. So I can give you 4 examples where a political transition mission was actually mandated. Why was this not done for Afghanistan is a question which only the P5 can answer, because they are the ones who, if you remember, in March 2020, the United States pushed forward this resolution endorsing the Doha Agreement, or the bilateral agreement between the United States and the Taliban. But it did not contain this. And I hope that in the months, in the next few weeks, as the UN reviews the mandate for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, that this concept of a political transition mission will be introduced so that the UN and humanitarian agencies can have the security of a framework document from the UN Security Council with which to operate and fulfill the benchmarks that Ambassador Lakshmi Puri has so beautifully underlined. Now, the third area of priority area for India in the UN Security Council has been to make peacekeeping more effective. And I think that there are 2 issues here. On one issue, India has made tremendous progress, which is to bring peacekeeping operations into the real world of the 21st century by integrating technology. And the whole software platform of Unite Aware, which has been introduced in 4 peacekeeping missions already, provides this domain awareness, which is critical for making peacekeepers responsive and for humanitarian peacekeepers, especially humanitarian peacekeepers, to respond to crises before they actually overtake civilian populations. So I think that that's a huge plus point, which has been adopted unanimously by Resolution 2589, which was adopted during India's presidency. The other part of making peacekeeping effective, which our Prime Minister has consistently spoken about, is to also ensure that the peacekeeping countries which contribute troops take part in decisions of the Security Council, which are dominated by the P5. Yeah. And I think that this is a work in progress, and I hope very much that by the time India has its 2nd presidency in December 2022, we will have with us the integration, the commitment of the Security Council that Article 44 of the UN Charter cannot be ignored anymore, and that countries which contribute troops who are not represented in the Council do take part in direct consultations on the deployment of their troops, because that's the only way to make UN peacekeeping more effective. You cannot micromanage peacekeeping troops from a P5 perspective any longer. The world has changed. Colonies have come up. We are independent countries. We will not be able to follow decisions taken with the 1945 perspective. And the 4th and final priority that India put forward was the human-centric focus on the decisions of the Security Council. And I'm glad that, the maritime security meeting, even the discussions on peacekeeping, and the other discussions which have taken place throughout this month. India has been very actively involved in presiding over discussions on Syria, on Yemen, on the Middle East, on African issues like Sudan and Mali and Central African Republic. In each one of these meetings, and there's so many of these meetings, 10 or 12 of them that have taken place, the focus of India has been, as I said, on bringing the human dimension to the forefront through the ability of the Security Council to create the environment to hold elections and to bring accountability and to bring a focus on the people of these countries which are in conflict today through their representative governments. And this is something that again has worked. It's not that we are sort of dealing with something idealistic in the future. The case of Liberia, the most famous example of Liberia, where President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf herself publicly spoke of the way India's women peacekeepers were able to instill this kind of dimension, which allowed Liberia to transition out of peacekeeping and into peace building and into a new future. So that's the kind of model that that India has pushed back. But I would like to conclude by a word of caution that the world of 1945 continues to dominate the decisions of the Security Council. It's unfortunate. Every time India has tried to push a reference in these resolutions which were adopted on peacekeeping mandates, the several of them that Ambassador Lakshmi Puri referred to, there has been a pushback on any attempt to introduce a commitment to sustainable development. I, for example, having negotiated Agenda 2030 on behalf of India, find it incredible that permanent members who are committed to Agenda 2030 refuse to acknowledge or even refer to sustainable development in the language of these resolutions. And I think that we need to bring these countries, these permanent members, into the real world of the 21st century, the world in which Agenda 2030 is the central agenda of the United Nations and is the reason why the UN agencies and the humanitarian agencies which work together in the field try and create a better future. And I think it brings us all back to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is going to be the testing ground again for this. And I think that the narrative must shift from the 2001 narrative of the Taliban and the terrorists and the good guys and the 1945 vision to the 2021 vision, where you have an empowered half the population of Afghanistan of women and children who have their voices. Now, you cannot suppress that any longer under deals done in Doha or in Quetta or anywhere else. I mean, this has to come into the forefront and center stage. And it's my hope that during the rest of India's membership of the Security Council, this issue of democratization and development will come in, because these are the key factors which India brings to the United Nations. It's our contribution from the decolonization debate onwards to today, to sustainable development and the use of technology for development. These are Indian USPs. And I think that this is what has to make a difference in the Security Council. And I hope that this is something that we are going to work on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukherji. I think this has been, again, a very rich contribution. And we will come back to some of these issues that you have raised. And I'm sure that's of great interest. Now let's move to the third panelist, the last but not the least, Ms. Eva Svoboda. I'm not sure I got your last name pronounced right, who's the Deputy Director for International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. Over to you, Eva. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. Raji, and you pronounced my last name perfectly. I'm delighted to be back at ORF, only virtually this time, hopefully next time again face-to-face. And I'd like to start by congratulating India on its non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and also for a successful presidency during August. Both Ambassador Puri and Ambassador Mukherji eloquently spoke about the various agenda points that India had on the program during that presidency. Now, with India just having completed its month-long presidency on the Council, it seems fitting that we speak about that one point that was also on the program, which is counterterrorism. And over the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to provide a perspective from a humanitarian organization and to highlight maybe some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities we see here. So in the last 2 decades, we have unfortunately seen a multiplication of terror-related activities globally. And in response, states and international organizations have developed increasingly robust measures to enhance their counterterrorism frameworks. And they've done that by either tightening existing counterterrorism measures or by introducing new ones. And in fact, in this area, India continues to play an active role at various multilateral fora, and we heard the number of examples to build a global consensus on tackling terrorism. There is no doubt that it is absolutely necessary and legitimate for states to take responsive action to ensure their security and that of their population. Terrorism negates the very basic principle of humanity. It goes against the underlying principles and core objectives of international humanitarian law, or IHL. In this regard, the ICRC condemns acts of terrorism, whether committed within or outside armed conflict and irrespective of their perpetrators, and is deeply distressed by the devastating impact of these acts on communities and individuals. When counterterrorism measures, including sanctions regimes, are undertaken, we would like to point out that it must be clear and firm, and states must be clear and firm about their full respect for applicable international law, in particular IHL and international human rights law. We have seen that counterterrorism measures, unfortunately, have had negative impacts on humanitarian action, and compounded with COVID-19, which of course remains relevant. Some of these restrictions have made access for impartial humanitarian organizations more difficult. We've identified 4 reasons that can lead to these challenges. Firstly, domestic measures, such as counterterrorism penal laws that prohibit acts of support. And often, unfortunately, they're very broadly defined and interpreted. And so some of this support to organizations that are designated as terrorists may criminalize, in fact, humanitarian activities and humanitarian actors. Second point, sanctions regimes have in various instances led to the impediment or delay of humanitarian operations. The third point is around donor requirements, notably around some of the clauses that require grantees to fully comply with donor CT and sanctions regulations. And the fourth is really a result of the first two, so the domestic legislation and sanctions, which lead really to what we would call an overcompliance or de-risking practices, for example, by financial institutions, so banks or suppliers. All of these elements can impede activities, many of which relate to the core mandate of the ICRC or other humanitarian organizations. And I'd like to state just a couple. So that could be visits, but also material assistance to detainees, including family visits, first aid training, war surgery seminars, international humanitarian law dissemination to weapon bearers, delivery of aid to meet the basic needs of the civilian population, especially in areas that are hard to reach, and medical assistance to wounded and sick fighters. We've also seen that restrictive measures have negative secondary effects and become problematic because they directly impact the ability of humanitarian organizations, for example, to import and export essential items. And they create what we would call a chilling effect for governments and donors who are increasingly reluctant to fund essential humanitarian activities when it comes to contexts that are affected by counterterrorism measures. Let me provide a concrete example where a particular sanctions regime posed challenges. And we've heard the example mentioned by my colleague Yahia. In 2011, as the famine in Somalia reached its peak, the Security Council, and that was pursuant to Resolution 1844, implemented sanctions against certain listed individuals and groups in Somalia, including Al-Shabaab. Now, the group's placement on the UN sanctions list and subsequent listing by UN member states, as well as the prohibition imposed by counterterrorism laws against providing support to terrorist groups, meant that a number of humanitarian organizations faced tremendous challenges in providing aid to the Somali population. These challenges arose because Al-Shabaab controlled territories throughout Somalia. And of course, humanitarian organizations need to negotiate access to reach populations in need. But we found that during these negotiations, Al-Shabaab often mandated that the humanitarian assistance be overseen, coordinated, or distributed by them. Under counterterrorism laws, the diversion of aid to Al-Shabaab would be prohibited and could result in criminal liability for aid workers. So even as government officials and donor countries provided assurances that individuals acting in good faith would not be prosecuted under counterterrorism laws prohibiting the provision of what is called material support and resources to designated terrorists, many humanitarian groups remained unsure or wary of prosecution. So that is also an element that we call, or that area that we call the chilling effect. This tension arose and contributed to the delayed response to the famine because states, on the one hand, called for increased humanitarian assistance because the situation was so dire, while also condemning the terrorist acts of Al-Shabaab. From this, it becomes clear that when humanitarian organizations are hindered in their mandate due to sanctions and restrictive counterterrorism measures, the consequences can be quite grave for those in need of protection, as well as for humanitarian workers. On this basis, the ICRC has on various occasions reminded states and international organizations that principled humanitarian action should not be impeded by CT measures, and that international humanitarian law rules must be factored in while taking initiatives aimed at combating terrorism. In this regard, the ICRC welcomes the recent developments at the UN Security Council with Resolution 2462 and 2482 of 2019, but also in November 2019, the EU Council conclusion on IHL humanitarian assistance, all of which require states to comply with international humanitarian law when devising and implementing CT measures, including sanctions regimes targeting entities and persons designated as terrorists. States and international organizations should therefore ensure that their CT measures are effectively respectful of IHL. And in fact, the Council has included similar language, most recently in the renewal of the sanctions regime for the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these are developments that are really heartening and continue to encourage us in our dialogue with states. Based on all of this, we would ask the following. One is around the protection of neutral, independent humanitarian action. So that's space that is required for neutral, independent humanitarian organizations to operate. And that can be done by ensuring that humanitarian organizations are able to maintain close proximity to affected populations and sustained engagement with parties to conflict. Protecting the humanitarian space means accounting for the specific risks and responsibilities facing local humanitarian actors. When they lose their capacity to be first responders or volunteers, civilians suffer the most. The next point is around ensuring that IHL is respected and implemented in all conflict zones, that IHL doesn't merely remain on paper, but is respected and implemented on the ground where it matters the most. We keep saying at the ICRC, IHL is not just a theoretical construct. It really, if translated correctly, can provide the protection needed in conflict areas. And finally, our most important ask is to consider and mitigate the humanitarian impact of counterterrorism measures by putting in place what we would call well-crafted standing humanitarian exemptions or carve-outs to carry out exclusively humanitarian activities as foreseen by IHL. So these carve-outs are really some kind of wording that says that humanitarian actors, humanitarian organizations are taken out of the scope of these sanctions and counterterrorism measures. We also seek that national legislation reflects this. And I'd like to point to Security Council Resolution 2462, which specifically urges states when designing and applying measures to counter the financing of terrorism to take into account the potential effect of those measures on exclusively humanitarian activities. And that includes medical activities that are carried out by impartial humanitarian actors in a manner consistent with international humanitarian law. That's a quote from Security Council Resolution 2462. So this is what was done, in fact, in the case of Somalia. The exemption was adopted in large part due to difficulties in the response to the famine in Somalia, which I have said before, really had an impact on the civilian population. In the past few years, and those just as a couple of examples, some states such as Switzerland, the Philippines, Chad, but also the EU and many others have adopted more protective language, contributing to improved safeguards for humanitarian action. So to conclude a couple of points, India is party to all the 4 Geneva Conventions. In fact, India was one of the earliest signatories to the conventions. India has also repeatedly affirmed that its legal framework is fully aligned with supporting the principles of IHL and its implementation. Most recently, India's Foreign Secretary at the UN Security Council briefing on protection of civilians and armed conflict, which focused on the preservation of humanitarian space, which took place on July 16th, stated that India remains committed to preserving the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence in responding to all humanitarian situations. For the ICRC, these are extremely encouraging words. As India continues to play a crucial role in the global stage in relation to the issue of counterterrorism, and I'd like to note here that, of course, India chairs important committees of the Security Council, which includes the Taliban Sanctions Committee and the Libyan Sanctions Committee. At the ICRC, we would really like to work with India in designing and developing practical measures that will help protect and serve the people who need humanitarian action and those who provide it. Ambassador Mukherji, you mentioned the human-centric or human-centered approach, and from a humanitarian organization's perspective, of course, that's an important element. We know that it is indeed possible to strike a balance between counterterrorism measures and humanitarian action, and we are ready to work with states towards achieving this goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Eva. That was again another terrific presentation. Since CT did come up in all of your presentations, and building consensus is always a trouble, especially in recent times, given the great power politics and so on and so forth. So one, I think, question I want to start with is how effective can UN efforts be, considering that UN has even had so much of issues agreeing sort of to come to an agreement on a definition regarding terrorism. So how feasible is it to expect international multilateral efforts since states have different policies, different interests? For example, would India consider Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorists, or how do we go about it? What about the Iranian support for terrorism and those kind of issues? So how can there be consistency on some of these questions since state interests are so different? So what is the common definition that we can work around with when it comes to any multilateral efforts, and certainly within the UN? So how do you, if you have to make serious moves on counterterrorism, I think the first step is to have a shared understanding and a common definition on terrorism, which itself has been a Herculean task in a sense. So let me start with Ambassador Puri, and then I come back to the rest of the two panelists.
Thank you, Raji. Yes, you have raised the heart of the problem in terms of why we don't, after so many years, have a convention on counterterrorism, and also on international terrorism, which is actually which would actually be a legally binding treaty that brings together all the states, and then under that you can have some standards which everyone is committed to, including on issues relating to the interface between counterterrorism and humanitarian and human rights considerations, or as was mentioned, the human face of everything. I would like to, I think what I have gathered from the reading or speaking to people who have been involved both in the UN Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, as well as those involved in the review process of the global strategy on counterterrorism, which has just been reviewed and adopted in the UNGA, that framework of that strategy, with all its imperfections, is what constitutes now the consensus, global consensus, with or without the definition, unfortunately. But I think what India did, and External Affairs Minister set out these 8 points on terrorism, can help us both negotiate this whole issue of why we are not being able to have a definition, and also to see draw the line where human rights, humanitarian considerations have to be served at all costs. On the other hand, how do states protect security interests and existential interests in many cases, as we have seen in many countries. So I think it's just worth very quickly. One is that we have to make sure that all countries exert the political will necessary. No justification, glorification of terrorism by anyone. So it can't be that, oh, it's self-determination, Palestine, so any terrorist act is okay. So, that is the first principle. And I think some of these principles, if we can all adopt and work on, no good or bad terrorists, no double standards, those justifying as, culpable, those justifying any terrorist act on the basis of, oh, they are good terrorists. They are not, so that they are as culpable. The third was reform of committees dealing with terrorism, sanctions. And I think some of those issues that were raised by Eva can be addressed in that reform, the sanctions. And also, but the part of about, I think what India has been finding also difficult is that some permanent members, some P5, blocking requests for listings, which have been put forward with well-founded information. So I think that is something that is also very important. Then also warns against exclusivist thinking that divides the world and harms our social fabric. You know, there is this new fashion of right-wing terrorists, left-wing terrorists, and all ethnically, racially motivated terrorism, and all kinds of new, terminologies that have come up. That only diffuses the very, focus on terrorism. It's an excuse in a way for terrorism, and condoning other kinds of terrorism, saying, oh, but there is this, and then there is that. So I think we have to be very careful, and I certainly feel very strongly that this is a very important point. Delisting and listing terrorists must be done objectively without political or religious bias. And then the sixth point is linkages between transnational organized crime and terrorism must be given weight. And then also FATF should identify weaknesses in detection and action on terrorist funding. And of course, that element that you're mentioning about how do we take into account, the humanitarian aspects in this whole issue of terrorist funding, money laundering, networks, etc., and punish the terrorists, but also, I think very importantly, call out the states that are either condoning it or colluding with it. And then, of course, budgetary allocation to UN bodies countering terrorism that needs to be stabilized and increased, because right now, I think, like the CTC only gets what 80% of its, or less, maybe 76% of its contributions come from two states, Saudi Arabia and I think Qatar. So, we need a regular budget allocation so it can function. That whole mechanism, the architecture of counterterrorism in the UN needs to be revamped. So I think these are very important things. Whilst we wait for that elusive consensus around a definition, I think we need to, in practical terms, address these issues.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Puri. Let me take that question to Ambassador Mukherjee and take it one step further. So what would be a minimum baseline agreement that most states can agree on regarding CT? And should state behavior regarding its own citizens be not included in CT? How would you see that in a sense? So what's the basic kind of a premise on which countries can come together? What is a minimum understanding that states need to have?
Well, thank you, Raji. Before I answer what you asked me, I'd just like to share with Eva that, she referred to the Geneva Convention. And the beauty of India's consistency in this is in 1946, we were among the three countries who co-sponsored the negotiation of the convention, the Geneva Convention outlawing genocide. So it started our journey hand in hand with the United Nations started at that point. And in March this year, in the governmental group of experts, which deals with cyber security issues, you are of course aware that we were among the experts who endorsed the recommendation to include international humanitarian law as part of the norms for securing cyberspace. So there's a consistency in India's approach, which I think needs to be talked about more. It's kept hidden away in the footnotes of reports, but probably that needs to be done. Now, to answer what you asked me, Raji, I think that, the issue of the two issues that you had raised earlier on definition and of terrorists and from different countries, the definition issue is something that actually has been recommended for a solution in the General Assembly through the 6th committee, the legal committee. And that is to conclude a legal convention, which is drafted by the experts and separated from this whole business of good terrorism and bad terrorism, which Ambassador Lakshmi Puri talked about. If necessary, that can be put into a resolution of the General Assembly to satisfy whichever country wants to have a domestic audience for it. But the legal convention is ready for for negotiation and adoption. And it follows the other 3 sectoral conventions which have been negotiated from 1995 onwards. And the beauty of this exercise is that it's the same person who has been responsible, Ambassador Rohan Pereira of Sri Lanka. He has been the chair of this process. He's a lawyer, and he was Sri Lanka's representative of the United Nations in New York, and now he's back in Sri Lanka. And so the person who has dealt with it as a lawyer has found this solution. And I think that now there's a need for political will, especially among the Organization of Islamic Countries, to actually agree to this, because this whole thing goes back to 1979, 80, and therefore there's a lot of history that's moved on. The second part of what you asked me is that without a definition, as Ambassador Lakshmi Puri said, without a definition, the UN and especially the UN Security Council has already acted. I mean, we have 52 resolutions on countering terrorism adopted by the Security Council without a definition. So the logical question is, if you cannot define it, how can you adopt a measure to counter it? So I think de facto, there is a clear understanding in Security Council resolutions, which have an international legal dimension, that this is what terrorism is and this is what we need to do to counter it. The problem that has been faced is to enforce the resolutions, and especially with states who don't accept their obligations under Article 25 of the UN Charter. A Security Council resolution has to be implemented by all states which have signed the treaty of the UN Charter. Now, if a state does not fulfill its obligations, then you have to enforce it to fulfill its obligations. And I think that that's a political issue, but the Security Council must take the bull by the horns. The question is, why do states get away by hosting terrorist groups, by allowing the territory to be used by terrorist groups, and not face the music? Because the music is there in the treaty of the UN Charter. So therefore, I think that this is a political issue, but I think it needs to be addressed. And I think the obligations that have been put on all member states by the Omnibus 1373 resolution on countering terrorism, they have to be enforced. And I think I would like to see the Security Council actually adopt some sanctions measures against states which are sponsoring and harboring terrorist groups, which have been proved. I mean, it's not the monitoring teams of the UN have actually said where these people are located. So why doesn't the Security Council act on information given to it by monitoring teams? I mean, you even have to look at the monitoring team report in June this year of the Taliban Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, Ambassador Fittle Brown of the United Kingdom, who heads it. He's given the report. It's available on the net. Ambassador Tirumurti, as chair of the Taliban Sanctions Committee, has circulated it to all member states. So anybody can read it. And you can read in that report where these people are, who is harboring them, and who is helping them. And why can't the Security Council enforce? And the third point which you asked me on these terrorists from various countries, how can we deal with them? I think the agreement in the United Nations project of international cooperation is that you bring the material into on the table, and they go on to what is known as the consolidated list. There's a consolidated list of terrorists and terrorist entities maintained by the UN Security Council. And if there are terrorists from any of the countries that you mentioned who need to be put onto that list, put them on the list. But you cannot expect at the same time to not put them on the list and then introduce unilateral sanctions on them. Because that will not work, since the enforcement of unilateral sanctions is, as we all know, is left to each country to decide on. Because no country will accept another country's domestic legislation as its own domestic legislation. So that's the basic problem. So I think that these are the points that I'd like to make in response to what you asked me. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think the issues very clearly outlined the problems and the ways to kind of mediate them, in a sense, finding a mediated solution in terms of, but at the same time, I think it's very clear the effectiveness of the charter in kind of dealing with some of these issues. I think on any number of issues, I think it's been very clear. Eva, I want to ask you a question, especially given your background and the humanitarian action issues that you have brought out. What can states do to address or mitigate potential tension between CT legislation and humanitarian action, in a sense, and what are the ways that you see in dealing with that?
Thank you. Indeed, and perhaps just going back to what my fellow panelists just said, a hugely important role of the Security Council, but it's not the only multilateral. Of course, it's you know, a key forum, but then there are others, regional ones, for example. And I'd like to mention the African Union, which has it's called the African Model Anti-Terrorism Law, which has in fact some of the wording in there. So, and I mentioned the EU. So I think there's efforts at the Security Council and in other fora that deal with counterterrorism. And we heard the counterterrorism strategy, of course, CTED. So there are a number of these where these exchanges happen. And then I would go maybe a step lower in a sense, and it builds on what Ambassador Mukherji just said. Any Security Council resolution is at its most effective when it's translated into domestic law. And I think that's a critical element. States can then decide how they want to translate it into domestic law. So let us take a Security Council resolution as an example where it says, you know, take into account the humanitarian activities, but a state can decide to make it a bit stronger and say, take measures and take into account rather than taking into account. So I think the translation into domestic legislation is hugely critical. Then the other element is around providing guidance. Now, a state has different entities. Maybe the Ministry of Finance isn't as, or has a different viewpoint from the Ministry of Affairs, in a sense that it has a different prerogative or a different angle at which it comes to it. Ministry of Interior as well. So I think it's important, A, to have that conversation cross-departmental, to understand from each viewpoint, how can this domestic legislation be best implemented, but also raise awareness to some of these challenges. We found that we have different discussions with different departments. We know that donor departments are very well versed with some of the humanitarian challenges, but maybe others don't. And so I think it's our role as well as a humanitarian organization to raise that awareness to some of the potential unintended negative consequences of these measures. So I think states can provide good guidance to either their own departments, but then also to, let's say, the private sector as well, to banks, to financial institutions, because again, they, and it goes back to what I had mentioned earlier, financial institutions might not be willing to fund certain activities because they feel they might be falling foul of counterterrorism or sanctions legislation or sanctions regimes. And so I think providing guidance to some of these entities would be a critical role as well, or a critical element as well. And I think really, and I'd like to close with that, it's that conversation cross-departmental, but also including humanitarian organizations, so they can also share some of their concerns with state entities. Again, there is not a fundamental contradiction between two. Humanitarian action activities can take place in these counterterrorism operations, but I think we need to find that space where humanitarian activities can continue to provide assistance and protection for people in need, while at the same time also responding to the concerns of states.
Thank you, Eva. Let me take a slightly broader question. And given that we are in an era of great power competition, global and both globally as well as in Asia, there is a power transition. Great power politics is at its peaking. It's at its peak in a sense. So would counterterrorism continue to have the same international importance? And considering India itself faces a significant conventional military threat from China, for instance, shouldn't it focus more on some of the conventional kind of threats and China-related problems than CT? And also, would CT continue to have the same kind of relevance in an era of great power politics as we are witnessing today, right in our neighborhood, in a sense? Let me start with Ambassador Mukherji, and then we'll come to the other two panelists.
Well, Raji, I think that, if you put this broad question of prioritizing, the answer will depend on what is the ground reality. Now, if you go back to 26th of November 2008, the ground reality was that this was the first time a terrorist act took place against India, which did not involve Kashmir. It involved the financial capital of India. It involved India's emergence as a major economy. And it involved, of course, India's social fabric and so on and so forth. So it changed the way we in India looked at the world, and we responded to the world. Now, when we look at the other issue that you mentioned of the growth of China and the rise of China, or the assertions of China, that again depends on the issue. Galwan in May 2020 was an issue which changed the way that a lot of people in India responded to the rise of China, and made it very immediate. So I think that when we look at great power rivalries, we need to place it in the context of specific events. And I would say that in terms of counterterrorism, what is happening today in Afghanistan actually will, I think, shake up a lot of people to understand how did it all begin. And it began in June 2011. Most people in India don't know that. It began with an understanding between the 5 permanent members, the great powers, as you call them. All of them agreed to bring the Taliban back into power in Kabul. It was, and none of the rest of the world had woken up to it. Now today, when women and children and vulnerable Afghans are facing this problem on the ground, the rest of the world is woken up to it. And that's why I think that this issue of countering terrorism, whether it will be a priority or not, will get interwoven into the humanitarian impact of what is terrorism all about. And I think if Mumbai 26 November 2008 had a tremendous humanitarian impact, so too will what is happening in Afghanistan have a tremendous humanitarian impact, which will far outshadow whatever China is doing or not doing immediately in Asia. And that's the answer, because elected people, representative governments have to respond to what's happening on the ground. And the bigger threats which are known, which are not sort of brushed under the carpet, but will become priorities in a longer term perspective. But the immediate perspective will be to secure your country, because you cannot afford to run a country if you can't secure it. And that's the answer I would give.
Okay, Ambassador Puri, would you want to sort of look at that issue?
Yes, absolutely. No, I agree with what has been said, but I would also add that for India, at least on its western border, it is very clearly a case of not a hot war, but a war by other means, the war by terrorism. So it is a continuing, source of insecurity and waging a war against terrorism on a continuous basis. Every day, I mean, you open the newspaper or the television, that is the reality that India will continue to live with. And I don't think globally too, this whole specter of terrorism is over just because the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan and the Taliban has said, we will not allow our territory to be used. Unfortunately, we already saw that, first of all, Taliban, whether they will keep their word, who is Taliban, what are the components of the Taliban government that come up. And I'm 100% certain that there are elements who are or who were very clearly in the UN list or otherwise who are going to be part of the government or are going to be given as a kind of negotiating leverage, who are going to be given haven. They're going to use that territory. They're going to use resources in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, I hope it doesn't happen. But, let us not delude ourselves. And then the third thing, which I would like to mention in the larger context of what we have gone through in COVID-19 and so on, all that, the WMDs and counterterrorism. So the global strategy now also talks very much about that. That is an even bigger threat than conventional war on Galwan or, the kind of wars that you mentioned should be refocused on. Of course, we should continue to arm ourselves against those kind of aggressions or wars, but WMD, bioterrorism, chemical weapons terrorism, and also nuclear terrorism, all these are very real dangers that we face. Every country faces, and of course for India, we are really, really vulnerable on all these three fronts.
Thank you. Eva, do you want to add some thoughts? Oh, yeah. Do you have some thoughts on this particular question of, CT that may be losing its focus and relevance because of the great power competition that is also kind of picking up greater momentum in a sense? Do you have any sense on that? And then I think we will come towards some of the wrapping up kind of phase. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to provide some thoughts about kind of conflict dynamics and what we've seen. And I wish I could look and tell you what the world will look like in 20 years, but certainly looking back, what we've seen is a multiplication of non-state armed groups, and some of them with a good chain of command and others not, to where we're not quite sure who's in charge. And so the number of groups, the duration of conflicts, I'm afraid also has extended. So this makes it and I'm speaking, of course, from the humanitarian perspective or from the perspective of a humanitarian organization, makes it extremely difficult to understand, analyze, have contacts with everyone. For us, it's essential that we're in contact with everyone. Why? Because a lot of these groups control territory. They can give access. They can allow us, they can provide us with the access we need to provide the assistance and protection people need in times of conflict. But it's also important because we can then tell them, look, these are your obligations under international humanitarian law. And so looking at it from a conflict dynamic, it means that we need to be able to really have that space to operate, to be able to be in touch with everyone. And Afghanistan was mentioned numerous occasions. It's been since 1987 that the ICRC has been present there. And of course, we've had contacts with or tried to have contacts with everyone throughout, because it's the only way that really gives us the space to operate. So that is something that we've been working on since we were created. How it will develop, it's hard to say, but having the possibility to engage with everyone, remind them of their obligations, and then make them see that civilians need the help, in conflict, and somebody needs to provide them. Unless they can provide it themselves, then that is a critical element. And so this is where we're, from our standpoint, which is really an important element, having contact with everyone.
Thank you, Eva. And I think we are nearing our finishing line in a sense. And I think I just want to make concluding sort of remarks at the stage. If any of our panelists have a 1-minute statement to make, I think then that's good. Ambassador Puri, do you want to make a really short statement in terms of how you want to conclude this?
I would like to say that, with the UNSC resolution, we have these benchmarkings. And I do hope that not only the member states who are now members of the UN Security Council, but beyond them, all member states, in their engagement with the emerging Taliban regime, enforce and insist on getting this enforced, this UN Security Council resolution and the benchmark set by it, observed by the government. I think it would really help Taliban themselves and Afghanistan and Afghans most of all in their transition out of where they were and into right now what seems a very uncertain and future for them. So I really hope that we have an instrument in this resolution, that it really gets implemented, and that member states, whether it's Europe, and I would really particularly like to say Europe has to also stand firm behind these principles, humanitarian, human rights, and others, that benchmarking that has been done before they rush to, normalize, recognize whatever they want to do with the Taliban government in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. Ambassador Mukherji.
Well, I would like to, I'd just like to say that it was an interesting discussion on India's presidency and the takeaways. And I think that, as has been said, it provides an indicator of what the next 15, 16 months will be and will hold for India. It's my hope that we will make more progress on reformed multilateralism. We will make some progress on reforming the working procedures of the Security Council. And if we can, for example, even make some progress on limiting the use of the veto on mass atrocity crimes, which is a major humanitarian issue, that would be some incremental progress towards reforming the 1945 worldview, which unfortunately still dominates the Security Council. And I think that that's something I really like to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Eva?
Thank you. I'd like to circle back to what Ambassador Puri just said about frameworks and Security Council resolutions that we have that have shown progress and that we can build on. And again, coming from the viewpoint of a humanitarian organization, our aim is to help those who are in need in a conflict situation. And so building on these progress, on these developments, on this progress, to achieve a better life for people and who are caught up in conflict, I think should be the kind of the guiding star. How can this be achieved? I think using that progress, using these discussions at a multilateral level, at a regional level, and then again coming back to the critical importance of domestic legislation. So I think for us, if we can build on that and then help people who really by no fault of their own are caught up in conflict, then I think that should be, that would be a good way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all my panelists. I think this has been a terrific discussion. But before I close, let me ask Mr. Alibi, if you want to make some concluding remarks at this stage.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. I really enjoyed this interesting discussion. It was really, thank you for both ambassadors for your well-articulated, informed, and really thoughts. It's very, very important for us because, the ICRC is known by maybe operation and in the field, but the other pillar is as a guardian of international humanitarian laws, and so since more than a century, we need to listen also, and we need to bring the evidence, operational also evidence, to the table, to the states and to the stakeholders, decision makers, and to inform them, but also we need to listen to inform our action. And it has been always I think the strength of this organization that to survive over all, 160 years. And this is true more than ever. I do think really that today we will agree that clearly we are at a moment where collectively we need to adapt, maybe to the word post-45, as Ambassador Mukherji was insisting. Clearly, everything has changed, and we see it from our perspective in many conflict areas. You were speaking about Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, and I think it resonates to me, and maybe now I think also to Eva, as I have been working in all these contexts. And we need to adapt clearly to the conflicts, to the new emerging issue, the terrorism. But the way collectively we are trying to solve this problem are the same since many decades. And clearly there is a need to adapt. But we need also to adopt a more systematic more, I would say, smart and intelligent approaches, and for what to strike this coexistence that we need all collectively between security requirements, interest of states, but I think the most important for all of us, what is our shared humanity, and we need to strike this balance between humanitarian imperatives and all this political agenda. I will end by telling that we were really, I'm happy and I feel lucky to be in India these days, this year, because all these issues, maritime security, peacekeeping, and now counterterrorism and humanitarian are really resonating. We are actors in directly and indirectly in all these issues, and we are happy to engage with India. And I will end up by this need to adapt and adopt. I think it can be done through also the of a country like India, given their record and the human dimension always integrated in their policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alibi. And I think this has been a fantastic, terrific conversation, rich conversation, covering areas from counterterrorism to Afghanistan in greater detail to peacekeeping operations and, of course, maritime security. So as a country, of course, that has been the victim of terrorism for decades now, it's rightfully focused on counterterrorism. But the China-related problem, the rise of China, has thrown up a lot of different challenges, and of course, maritime security is one of those challenges. So rightfully bringing India, trying to bring in some sort of balance between some of the traditional sets of issues that has encountered India, but also some of the more newer set of challenges like maritime security into the during its presidency of the UN Security Council was something that was that's been helpful in steering the agenda in a sense. And I think this has been a terrific conversation, and I'm almost completely out of time, and I'm going to thank all the panelists and end this conversation right now. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to ICRC for partnering with us and joining us in this conversation. Thank you again. Stay well, stay safe.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank